The head fell. But the blood, it would not stop. It gushed forth like a geyser, flooding the throne room, defying nature itself. The physician whispered in terror, he died without fear. That night Al-Hajjaj froze, though braziers burned his flesh. By morning, worms crawled from his mouth. The scholar had called upon Al-Adl. The curse was answered. The sun that hangs over the scorched plains of Iraq does not merely shine, it judges, burning with a ferocity that turns the very sand into glass and the air into a suffocating shroud of misery. Yet, in the year 95 of the Hijra, the heat rising from the stones of the newly built city of Wazit was not solely from the heavens, but from the feverish nightmare of a man who had appointed himself the shepherd of death. Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi sat within the cool, shadowed recesses of his green palace, a structure raised upon the backs of the broken, yet the air around him smelled perpetually of wet copper and stale fear. He was not merely a governor, he was the scourge, the iron hand of the Umayyad Caliphate, a man who believed with terrifying conviction that the only way to cure the sickness of rebellion was to bleed the patient dry. To walk the streets of his city was to walk through a graveyard that had not yet been buried, where the silence was not one of peace, but of breath held in terror. He had constructed a prison without a roof, a vast and cruel pit where thousands of souls were left exposed to the blistering sun by day and the biting cold by night, their skin peeling and their minds unraveling under the gaze of the stars. It is said that when the mothers of Iraq wished to silence their weeping babes, they did not speak of monsters or ghouls, but whispered the name of Hajjaj, for his malice was far more real and far more hungry than any fable. He had paved his road to glory with the skulls of 120,000 human beings, a number so staggering that it defies the comprehension of the sane mind, yet to him, they were but necessary excisions, the removal of rot to preserve the body of the state. He dined on fine meats while men rotted in chains a mere stone's throw away, his heart hardened against the pleas of the widow and the orphan, for he had convinced himself that he was the sword of God, unsheathed to chastise a wicked generation. But there is a peculiar madness that takes root in the soul of a tyrant who has never known the check of a limit, a blindness that mistakes patience for permission. As he looked out over his dominion, counting his soldiers and his gold, Hajjaj felt invincible, a titan who had wrestled the turbulent province into submission through the sheer brutality of his will. He did not know that the cries of the oppressed do not vanish into the void, they ascend, gathering like storm clouds before the throne of the one who names himself Al-Adl, the absolute justice. The heavy silence that filled his halls was not the quiet of submission, but the deep intake of breath before the scream, and while his guards watched the gates for assassins of steel, they could not guard against the inevitable arrival of a verdict that had already been written in the heavens. The stage was set, the blood had been spilled, and the scales were tipping dangerously, waiting for the single feather of truth that would bring the entire terrifying edifice crashing down upon the head of the builder. While the shadow of the Green Palace lengthened across the suffering lands of Iraq, casting a pall of despair that seemed to eclipse the sun itself, a very different light burned in the holy precinct of Mecca, a light that the tyrant sought desperately to extinguish. For 10 long years, the most brilliant jewel of the scholars, Sa'id ibn Jubair, had drifted like a phantom through the Hijaz, moving from the peaks of mountains to the valleys of silence, evading the spies and bloodhounds of the Umayyad state. He was not a man who commanded legions or brandished steel, he was a man of ink and prayer, a dark-skinned Ethiopian whose lineage was humble but whose stature in the eyes of the divine was like that of a mountain that cannot be moved. He carried within his chest the entirety of the revelation, his heart a vessel of such profound tranquility that it was said the wild beasts of the wilderness recognized his sanctity. There is a story, whispered with trembling lips by the Bedouins around their fires, that one night Sa'id sought refuge in a desolate hermitage, and a great lion, a man-eater of terrible repute, approached him as he stood in prayer. The monk who watched from the safety of his tower cried out in horror, expecting the scholar to be torn asunder, but Sa'id merely glanced at the beast and spoke to it as one speaks to a misbehaving child, commanding it to depart if it was not sent by Allah, and the great predator, humbled by a power far fiercer than hunger, lowered its head and sat guard until the dawn. It was this man, this tamer of lions and possessor of secrets, that Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf feared more than any army of rebels. The tyrant knew that as long as Said drew breath, there remained a voice that could articulate the magnitude of his crimes, a living witness to the truth that justice is not defined by the sword of the victor but by the law of the Creator. The order went out from Wazit, written in ink that might as well have been venom, commanding the governor of Mecca to seize the scholar and send him to his doom, or else face the wrath of the scourge himself. The net began to tighten, not with the clamor of battle, but with the insidious creep of betrayal. Said knew the hour was approaching, for the air grew heavy with the portent of his destiny, yet he did not flee when the soldiers of the Caliph finally encircled his place of retreat in the barren expanse known as Dub, near the holy city. He could have slipped away into the labyrinthine valleys where no horse could follow, but he remained still, his face turned towards the heavens, for he had seen in the stillness of his heart that the time for hiding had ended and the time for witnessing had begun. When the captain of the guard, a man whose hands shook despite the sword at his hip, approached him, he found Said not cowering in the dust, but engaged in the recitation of the holy verses, his voice steady and melodious, unmarred by a single tremor of fear. The soldiers, hardened men who had slaughtered without mercy, found themselves paralyzed by the aura of the man they had come to chain. They looked upon him and saw not a fugitive, but a king without a crown, and a terrible dread seized their limbs. It was Said who broke the silence, extending his hands to receive the shackles, comforting his captors with the unsettling assurance that they were merely instruments of a will far greater than Hajjaj. He told them that he had fled only until he realized that flight was a defiance of his fate, and now, he walked willingly into the jaws of the beast. The journey from the sanctuary of Mecca to the slaughterhouse of Wazit was a procession of eerie contradictions. The prisoner rode with his head high, his tongue wet with the remembrance of God, while his captors rode in a sullen, fearful silence, glancing back at him as if they were transporting a terrifying talisman that might consume them at any moment. They traveled through the scorching days and the freezing nights, and at every stop, the people came out to gaze upon the face of the scholar, weeping openly, for they knew that wisdom itself was being dragged to the block. Said did not weep, he laughed softly at the absurdity of the world, marveling at how men could be so blinded by the glitter of power that they would eagerly sell their eternal souls for a few fleeting moments of favor with a tyrant whose flesh would soon be worm's meat. He spent his nights in prayer, standing for hours while the guards slept fitfully, plagued by nightmares of the crime they were helping to commit. As the imposing walls of Wazit finally rose from the haze of the horizon, looming like the gates of a fortress built by demons, Said ibn Jubair did not look with dread upon the city of his death. Instead, he looked upon it with the pity of a doctor observing a terminal patient, knowing that within those walls awaited a test that would shatter the arrogant and elevate the humble. The chains around his ankles clanked with a heavy, rhythmic tolling, sounding less like the bonds of a prisoner and more like the ominous ticking of a clock counting down the final seconds of Al-Hajjaj's sanity. The lion of the desert had been captured, yes, but the hunters had forgotten that bringing a lion into the house does not make it a pet, it merely ensures that when the blood is finally spilled, it will be the house itself that is torn apart. The stage was now set for the final collision, where the force of absolute tyranny would crash against the immovable object of absolute faith, and only one would remain standing when the dust of history settled. The great iron-bound doors of the Green Palace groaned open with the sound of a tomb unsealing, revealing a cavernous hall that seemed to swallow the light of the world. Into this belly of the beast walked Said ibn Jubair, his chains chiming a discordant melody against the polished marble floor, a sound that echoed through the vast emptiness like the tolling of a funeral bell. The air within was cold, unnaturally so, chilled not by the wind but by the sheer, suffocating weight of the dread that radiated from the figure seated at the far end of the chamber. There, upon a throne raised high above the heads of men, sat Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, clad in robes of crimson silk that shimmered like fresh blood, his face a mask of stony malice. To his right and to his left stood the executioners, men chosen for the size of their arms and the blackness of their hearts, holding broadswords that had drunk the life of the innocent until the steel itself seemed stained a permanent, ghostly red. A leather mat, the dreaded gnat, lay spread before the throne, stiff with dried gore, waiting for its next victim, a silent testament to the butchery that served as the governor South Daily Court. The courtiers and guards, hundreds of them lining the walls, stood frozen in a paralysis of terror, their eyes fixed on the ground, for they knew that to meet the gaze of the scourge on a day such as this was to invite death. But Said did not look at the ground, he looked straight ahead, his eyes clear and piercing, walking with a measured, tranquil gait that infuriated the tyrant before a single word had even been spoken. Hajjaj watched the scholar approach, his fingers gripping the arms of his throne until his knuckles turned white, his breath coming in short, sharp hisses. He had expected a broken man, a trembling wretch begging for mercy, but instead, he saw a reflection of a peace he could never possess, and it burned him like a brand. When Said finally halted before the steps of the throne, the silence that stretched between them was thick enough to choke on. Hajjaj broke it with a voice that rumbled like distant thunder, dripping with venom and mockery. "What is thy name?" he demanded, though he knew it well. It was a game of power, a ritual of humiliation. Said answered calmly, "Said ibn Jubair, which means the happy one, son of the repairer." Hajjaj's face twisted into a sneer of contempt. "Nay," the tyrant spat, leaning forward like a viper ready to strike, "you are Shaykhi ibn Khuzair, twisting the meaning to the wretched one, son of the broken." It was a childish insult, yet deadly in its intent, meant to strip the prisoner of his identity, but Said merely smiled, a sad, knowing smile that cut deeper than any blade. "My mother knew my name better than thee," he replied softly. The audacity of the response sent a ripple of shock through the hall, no one spoke to Hajjaj thus and lived to draw another breath. The tyrant's eyes narrowed into slits of black fire. "Then tell me," Hajjaj hissed, seeking to entrap the scholar in a web of treason, "what sayest thou of Muhammad?" Said's voice rose, filling the hall with a resonance that seemed to shake the very pillars. "He is the prophet of mercy, the seal of the prophets," he declared, his face glowing with a light that the shadows of the palace could not dim. Frustrated, Hajjaj shifted his attack, seeking a political slip, a word that he could use to justify the slaughter. "What sayest thou of the caliphs? What sayest thou of Ali and Uthman? Who is in paradise and who is in hell?" The court held its breath. This was the trap, to answer was to court death from either the partisans of the state or the dictates of the faith. But Said was not playing a game of politics, he was speaking from the vantage point of the eternal. "Is it for me to judge the unseen?" he asked, his voice steady as a rock. "The knowledge of them is with my Lord in a record. My Lord is neither in error nor does he forget." Hajjaj slammed his fist against the armrest, the sound cracking like a whip. "I wish for thee to choose," he roared, his composure slipping, the veins in his neck bulging against his collar. "I wish to know whom thou lovest and whom thou hatest." Said looked at the tyrant with a gaze of profound pity. "I love whomever Allah loves, and I hate whomever Allah hates." The ambiguity was a mirror, and in it, Hajjaj saw his own monstrosity reflected back at him. He knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he was not among the beloved. Desperate to break the scholar's spirit, Hajjaj commanded his servants to bring forth his treasures. Men rushed forward bearing trays of gold, rubies, and emeralds, piling them before Said's feet until they glittered like a mound of fire in the dim light. "Behold," Hajjaj gloated, "if thou wilt but bow to me, all this shall be thine." Said looked down at the wealth that men murdered for, and then looked back at Hajjaj with eyes full of tears, not of greed, but of sorrow. "O Hajjaj," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion, "if this is for the sake of Allah, then it is good. But if this is to make thee arrogant against the will of God, then know that it is but the fuel of hellfire." He turned his face away from the gold as if it were rotting meat. Hajjaj let out a screech of fury, kicking the trays over, scattering the priceless gems across the floor where they rolled like severed eyes. "Woe unto thee, Said," he screamed, standing up from his throne, his shadow looming long and terrible over the prisoner. "By Allah, I shall kill thee with a killing such as no man has ever died before." Said did not flinch. He did not step back. He met the tyrant's rage with a calm that was almost supernatural. "If you do so," Said said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried to the furthest corners of the room, "then you shall ruin my world, but I shall ruin your hereafter." The words hung in the air, heavier than the stone roof above them. Hajjaj was trembling now, not with power, but with a strange, consuming vibration that started in his hands and spread to his core. He felt small, stripped naked before a judge he could not bribe or bully. "Guard," he shrieked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched wail of desperation. "Bring the executioner. Unsheath the sword. Let this man's head be severed from his body, for he has vexed me beyond all endurance." The massive executioner stepped forward, his blade gleaming in the torchlight, and the courtiers turned their faces away, unable to watch the extinguishing of such a light. But as the steel was drawn, Said laughed, a soft, genuine laugh. Hajjaj froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Why dost thou laugh?" the tyrant demanded, his voice trembling. "I laugh," Said replied, looking directly into the eyes of his murderer, "at your audacity before Allah, and at Allah's forbearance towards you." It was the final seal. There would be no mercy, for mercy requires a human heart, and Hajjaj had long ago traded his for a stone. The command was given, the gnat was prepared, and the stage was set for the act that would echo through history not as a victory for the tyrant, but as the moment his doom was signed in blood. The air in the hall grew so heavy that men felt they were breathing water, and the very shadows seemed to lean in, hungry and waiting for the soul that was about to be unleashed. The leather mat, known as the gnat, was unrolled across the marble floor with a heavy, slapping sound that echoed like a dead hand striking water, a sound that made the stomachs of the hardened guards turn to water. It was a terrible artifact, this sheet of cured hide, stiffened by layers of dried gore from 1,000 necks, a portable altar of death that accompanied al-Hajjaj wherever he went, a dark shadow that drank the life of the rebellion. Said ibn Jubair looked down at the stained surface, not with the revulsion of a man about to die, but with the curiosity of a traveler reaching the final gate of a long and arduous journey. The executioner, a giant of a man whose face was hidden behind a veil of black linen, stepped forward, his breathing heavy and raspy in the suffocating silence of the hall. He gripped the hilt of his broadsword, a blade of Damascus steel that shimmered with a lethal, cold beauty, its edge honed to a razor's bite that could cleave bone as if it were parchment. The air in the vast chamber seemed to vanish, replaced by a pressure so intense that the torches flickering in their iron sconces seemed to dim, as if the very fire was afraid to witness what was to come. Hajjaj sat forward on his throne, his eyes wide and unblinking, a predator leaning in to savor the final shudder of his prey. He needed this, he needed to see the fear in Said's eyes, the moment where the certainty of faith cracks under the biological imperative to survive. He needed to prove that the scholar was just flesh and blood, just another trembling wretch who would beg for a moment more of life. But Said did not beg. As the rough hands of the guards forced him down onto the leather, he did not struggle or plead. Instead, he adjusted his robes with dignity, turning his face towards the south, towards the holy Kaaba in Mecca, the center of the world, the axis around which his soul revolved. "Turn him away!" Hajjaj shrieked, his voice cracking with a sudden, petty fury. He could not bear to let the man die facing the house of God, he wanted him to die facing the nothingness, to strip him of even this final comfort. Turn his face from the Qibla. Let him die looking at the Christian lands, or the fire of the Magians, but not the house of Allah. The guards, terrified of their master's wrath, scrambled to grab the scholar, twisting his body, forcing his shoulders around so that he faced the opposite direction. It was a final act of spite, a childish attempt to sever the connection between the servant and the master. But as they wrestled him into position, Said's voice rang out, clear and bell-like, reciting the verse that shattered the tyrant's intent into dust, and to Allah belongs the east and the west. So wherever you turn, there is the face of Allah. Indeed, Allah is all-encompassing and knowing. The word struck Hajjaj like a physical blow. The tyrant recoiled, his face flushing a deep, bruised purple. No matter how he twisted the body, he could not turn the heart. The geography of the earth meant nothing to a man whose soul was already anchored in the heavens. Face him to the ground. Hajjaj roared, slamming his hand against his thigh, his composure unraveling thread by thread. Press his face into the dust. Let him taste the earth he came from. The executioner, sensing the rising madness of his master, placed a heavy hand on Saeed's head, forcing his forehead down onto the blood-crusted leather. The smell of copper and rot was overwhelming, a stench that would have made a lesser man vomit in terror, but Saeed merely closed his eyes and whispered the words of the revelation, "From the earth we created you, and into it we will return you, and from it we will bring you forth another time." Every command Hajjaj gave, every attempt to degrade and humiliate, was met with a divine retort, a shield of scripture that turned the humiliation into a sermon. The court watched in a paralyzed trance. They were witnessing a duel fought not with swords, but with realities. Hajjaj was fighting with the weapons of the temporal world, force, pain, death, while Saeed fought with the weapons of the eternal, truth, patience, submission. And it was becoming terrifyingly clear that the man in chains was winning. Hajjaj was panting now, his chest heaving as if he had run a race. The defiance was unbearable. "Slaughter him," he screamed, the spittle flying from his lips. "Strike his neck. End this sorcery." The executioner raised the great sword, the steel catching the torchlight in a terrifying arc. The muscles in his arms bunched and coiled like serpents preparing to strike. Under the shadow of the blade, Saeed ibn Jubair raised his head one last time, his eyes locking onto the tyrant's face. He did not look at the sword, he looked at the man who commanded it. And then, he spoke the words that would haunt the knights of the Umayyad dynasty for generations to come. He did not ask for mercy. He did not ask for paradise. He invoked the name of Al-Adl, the just. "O Allah!" Saeed cried out, his voice thundering with a power that seemed to shake the very foundations of the palace. "Do not give this tyrant power over anyone after me. Let me be the last life he takes. Make my death the lock upon his bloodlust." The sword fell. It was not a clean sound. It was the wet, dull thud of steel meeting meat and bone, a sound that seemed to reverberate in the marrow of every person present. The head of the Saint of Mecca was severed from his body, rolling onto the leather mat with a grim finality. But then, the horror truly began. In a normal execution, the heart fails, the pressure drops, and the blood seeps out in a dark, spreading pool, a passive release of life. But this was different. As the head fell, the blood did not seep. It erupted. It burst forth from the severed arteries of the neck with the violence of a geyser, a crimson fountain that sprayed high into the air, splashing against the pristine robes of the courtiers, painting the marble pillars in horrific, abstract streaks of red. It pulsed with a rhythmic, furious energy, gushing and gushing as if the body contained an ocean of blood, as if the earth itself was vomiting it back up, refusing to swallow the evidence of such a crime. It flowed across the mat and spilled onto the floor, racing towards the throne like a living thing, a red serpent seeking the man who had shed it. Hajjaj recoiled, pulling his feet up onto his throne, his eyes bulging with shock. He had seen 1,000 men die. He had seen battlefields where the ground turned to mud. But he had never seen a single man bleed like this. It was unnatural. It was accusing. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the wet, slapping sound of the blood still pumping, still flowing, defying the very laws of nature. The body of Saeed lay prone, but the life force within it refused to be extinguished quietly. The crimson tide reached the steps of the throne and stopped there, pooling thick and bright, bubbling slightly as if boiling. Hajjaj stared at it, his hands trembling uncontrollably. "Why?" he whispered, his voice a husk of its former thunder. "Why does he bleed so much? Why does it not stop?" He summoned his chief physician, a man of great learning who stood by the wall, his face pale as milk. "Explain this," Hajjaj demanded, pointing a shaking finger at the torrent of red. "Is this sorcery? Did he consume some potion?" The physician stepped forward, careful not to step in the blood, bowing low, his voice trembling with the weight of the truth he had to speak. "O Amir," the doctor said, looking at the blood and then at the tyrant. "This is not sorcery. This is the truth of the body." He paused, fearing for his own life, but the science was undeniable. "When a man is afraid," the physician continued, "when he faces death with terror in his heart, his blood retreats. It flees from the limbs and rushes to the heart, seeking to protect the core of life. That is why the executed usually bleed little, their blood is hiding deep within them, frozen by fear." The doctor gestured to the headless corpse of Said, which still lay amidst the lake of crimson. But this man had no fear. His heart was steady. His pulse was calm. He did not tremble. His blood remained in his veins, flowing naturally to the very end because his soul was at complete peace. He bled because he was not afraid of you. The words hit Hajjaj harder than the curse. It was the ultimate defeat. He had killed the body, yes, but he had failed to conquer the man. The blood was the proof. It lay there, bright and oxygenated, a vibrant testament to a courage that Hajjaj, with all his armies and his gold, could never command. The tyrant slumped back into his throne, the grandeur of his position suddenly looking like a pathetic costume. He looked at the severed head of Said, which lay face up on the mat. The eyes were open. And in the flickering torchlight, to the horror of Hajjaj's unraveling mind, they seemed to be looking right at him. Not with anger. Not with hate. But with that same, unbearable pity. The curse had been spoken. The blood had been spilled. And as the servants rushed forward with buckets of water to wash away the stain, scrubbing frantically at the marble, Hajjaj watched with a growing, gnawing dread, realizing that no amount of water would ever wash this blood from his hands. The hall was cleared, the body dragged away, but the atmosphere remained heavy and electric, charged with a dark energy that seemed to cling to the walls. The just had been invoked. The court was adjourned. But the trial of Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf had only just begun. The sun set over Wazit, turning the sky the color of a bruise, and for the first time in his life, the scourge of God was afraid of the dark. The night did not bring sleep, it brought the echo of a laugh, the whisper of a prayer, and the phantom sensation of warm, wet liquid rising around his ankles, pulling him down, down, down into an abyss from which there would be no return. The night that descended upon the city of Wazit was not a curtain of peace, but a heavy shroud of suffocating velvet, thick with the unseen presence of things that belonged to the grave. The sun had fled the horizon as if in terror of what it had witnessed, leaving the green palace to be swallowed by a darkness that no torch could truly pierce. Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf retired to his bedchamber, a room of opulent luxury designed to cater to the whims of a king, with silken pillows stuffed with the down of rare birds and walls adorned with the finest tapestries of Persia. Yet, as the heavy cedar doors were barred shut, sealing him in with his own thoughts, the governor of Iraq found that the silence was not empty, it was screaming. He paced the floor, the marble cold beneath his feet, his mind replaying the final moments of the day like a loop of torture. He could still see the blood, that impossible, vibrant, living fountain of crimson that had refused to behave like the blood of a mortal man. He rubbed his hands together, scouring the skin until it was raw and red, washing them in basins of rosewater and musk, but the phantom scent of wet iron and copper clung to his nostrils, lodging itself in the back of his throat like a bitter almond. He was a man who had sent thousands to the void without a second thought, a man who slept soundly while the mothers of Kufa wept, but tonight, the architecture of his mind had shifted. The structural integrity of his soul, held together for decades by the mortar of arrogance and the belief in his own divine mandate, had developed a hairline fracture, and through that crack, the cold wind of the irrational was beginning to whistle. He dismissed his guards, unable to bear their eyes, for he felt that even the lowest spearman could see the trembling in his hands, the sudden fragility of the scourge. He lay down upon his bed, seeking the oblivion of sleep, commanding his body to rest just as he commanded armies to march, but the body, that treacherous vessel, refused to obey. His eyes remained wide open, staring at the intricate patterns of the ceiling, which in the flickering candlelight seemed to writhe and twist like a nest of vipers. When sleep finally came, it was not a mercy, but an ambush. It arrived in a sudden, jarring wave, dragging him down into a landscape of grey ash and endless ruin. In this dream, Hajjaj was not the governor, he was naked, small, and infinitely vulnerable, standing on a plain that stretched into eternity. And then he saw him. Sa'id ibn Jubair. But this was not the man in chains, this was a titan, a figure of blinding light and terrifying authority, whole and unblemished, holding his own severed head in the crook of his arm like a lantern. The head's eyes snapped open, blazing with a fire that scorched Hajjaj's very spirit, and the mouth opened to unleash a sound that was not a voice, but a thunderclap of judgment. "O enemy of God," the apparition roared, the sound vibrating through the marrow of the dreamer's bones. "Why did you kill me? For what sin did you spill my blood?" Hajjaj tried to run, but his feet were mired in a swamp of thick, coagulation blood. He tried to speak, to summon his guards, to recite his titles, but his mouth was filled with dust. The figure of Sa'id advanced, grabbing him by the shoulders with a grip like a vice of hot iron, shaking him until his teeth rattled, repeating the question over and over, a relentless litany of accusation: why? 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 Hajjaj woke with a scream that tore his throat raw, bolting upright in his bed, his body drenched in a sweat that smelled of sickness. The room was empty, save for the dancing shadows, but the voice was still there. It had followed him out of the dream. It was echoing in the corners of the room, whispering from behind the curtains, murmuring from the depths of the pillows. "Why did you kill me?" The terror was physical, immediate, and overwhelming. Hajjaj scrambled out of bed, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird desperate to escape a cage. He called out for his servants, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic wail that bore no resemblance to the command of a general. They rushed in, bearing lamps, their faces pale with worry, finding their master huddled in the corner of the room, shivering violently. "Cover me!" Hajjaj shrieked, his teeth chattering with a sound like dice rattling in a cup. "I am freezing. The cold of the grave is upon me." The servants heaped blankets of wool and fur upon him, layer after heavy layer, until he was buried beneath a mountain of fabric, but the shivering did not cease. It was a cold that defied physics, a zamhuru, the bitter, freezing punishment of the afterlife, that radiated from within his own marrow. He ordered braziers of coal to be brought close, piles of burning embers placed so near to his skin that they singed the fine hairs of his arms and blistered his flesh, yet he could not feel the heat. He was burning on the outside and freezing on the inside, a paradox of suffering that baffled the court physicians who were summoned in haste from their beds. They took his pulse and found it racing and erratic, they looked into his eyes and saw the dilated pupils of a man who is seeing things that are not there. They touched his skin and recoiled, for it felt like touching a corpse that had been left in the snow, yet he cried out that he was on fire. This was no fever known to medicine, this was the physical manifestation of a spiritual collapse, the body reacting to the sudden withdrawal of divine protection. As the days turned into a blur of agony, a new and more grotesque horror began to manifest. The hunger came first, a ravenous, bottomless void in his stomach that no amount of food could fill. He ate with the desperation of a starving wolf, devouring plates of meat, bread, and fruit, shoving the food into his mouth with trembling hands, yet the moment he swallowed, the hunger returned, sharper and more painful than before. It was as if he was feeding a beast that lived inside him, a parasite that consumed the sustenance before it could reach his own flesh. And then came the sensation. It started as a tickle in his gut, a subtle movement like the flutter of a moth's wing, but it quickly grew into a violent, churning turmoil. Hajjaj clawed at his abdomen, screaming that there were things moving inside him, things with legs and mandibles, gnawing at his entrails. The physicians, terrified and helpless, could do nothing but watch as the most powerful man in the caliphate was reduced to a writhing, weeping wreck. There is a dark and terrible account recorded by the historians, a detail so grim it chills the blood of the reader centuries later. In a desperate attempt to diagnose the affliction, a physician took a piece of fresh meat, tied it to a string, and lowered it down the tyrant's throat, leaving it there for a moment before pulling it back up. When the meat was retrieved, the room recoiled in collective horror. It was swarming with worms, strange, black, beetle-like creates that writhed and snapped with unearthly vigor. They were not the worms of the earth, they were the worms of decay, the agents of the grave that had come to claim him before he had even finished dying. The earth, it seemed, was impatient. It was rejecting him, sending its scavengers to consume the tyrant from the inside out, a literal manifestation of the corruption that had festered in his soul for decades. Hajjaj stared at the writhing meat, his eyes wide with the comprehension of his doom. He understood then, with a clarity that cut through the madness, that this was not a disease to be cured with herbs or potions. This was the decree. This was the signature of Al-Adl. He pushed the physicians away, his laughter bubbling up again, but this time it was the dry, rasping laughter of despair. "It is him," he whispered to the empty air, his voice a broken rasp. "It is Saeed. He has kept his promise." The palace became a prison of noise. Hajjaj could no longer endure silence, for in the silence, the voice of Saeed returned, asking the question, "Why did you kill me?" To drown it out, he ordered his guards to bang their shields, to shout, to make noise, but the whisper cut through the din like a knife through silk. He began to hallucinate freely, seeing the faces of the thousands he had slaughtered peering at him from the shadows, a legion of the dead come to witness his fall. He would leap from his bed, drawing a dagger, slashing at the air, screaming, "Get back! Get back, O Saeed! I have no quarrel with thee now." The servants whispered in the corridors that the scourge was fighting a war with ghosts, and the ghosts were winning. News of the governor's condition leaked out of the palace walls, spreading through the streets of Wazit and Kufa like wildfire. The people, who had walked in terror for 20 years, began to lift their heads. They did not celebrate with joy, for fear was etched too deep in their bones, but they whispered with a grim satisfaction. They gathered in the mosques, not to pray for his recovery, but to recite the verses of justice, knowing that the arrows of the night, the prayers of the oppressed, had finally found their mark. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was apocalyptic. The machinery of the state ground to a halt. Documents went unsigned, armies went uncommanded, judgments went unrendered. The center of the world had collapsed into a single room where a dying man fought a duel with his own conscience. Hajjaj tried, in a moment of lucid desperation, to prove that he was still the master of his fate. He ordered a prisoner to be brought to him, a common thief, intending to execute him, to prove that he could still take a life, that the curse of Saeed, "Let me be the last life he takes," was a lie. The man was dragged before the bed, trembling. Hajjaj reached for his sword, which lay by his side, but his hand was too weak to lift it. He commanded the guard to strike, but the words died in his throat, choked off by a sudden surge of bile and blood. He could not do it. He physically could not order the death. The block was placed, the executioner waited, but the order never came. Hajjaj lay gasping, tears streaming down his face, paralyzed by a force that held his tongue in a grip of iron. He waved his hand feebly, dismissing the prisoner. The thief ran from the room, realizing he had been saved by a ghost. As the 40th day approached, Hajjaj was no longer a man, he was a ruin. His body was wasted, his skin hanging off his bones like old parchment, his eyes sunk deep into their sockets, burning with the frantic light of the damned. He had not slept in weeks. He had not known a moment of peace. He spent his hours talking to Saeed, arguing his case, pleading for a respite that never came. "O Saeed," he would moan, rocking back and forth, "what is between me and thee? Why dost thou not leave me to my Lord?" But the answer was always the silence, and the gnawing, and the cold. He realized that he was being dismantled, piece by piece, stripped of his dignity, his power, his sanity, and finally, his life. The grandeur of his conquests, the cities he had built, the rebellions he had crushed, all of it was dust. He was alone in the universe, suspended in a void between a life of tyranny and an eternity of reckoning. The final stage had arrived. The courtiers stood at a distance, covering their noses against the stench of decay that radiated from the living body of the governor, watching the slow, agonizing implosion of a star that had once thought itself a sun. The curse was complete. The lock had snapped shut. And now, the door to the next world was creaking open, and Hajjaj knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he was not walking through it as a guest, but as a fugitive being dragged back to the scene of the crime. The end came not with a bang, but with a wretched, gasping whimper that seemed to suck the very air out of the city of Wazit. It was the 25th day of the month of Ramadan, in the year 95 of the Hijra, when the angel of death finally descended to claim the soul of the man who had sent so many souls prematurely to the grave. The Green Palace, once the vibrant, thrumming heart of a terrifying empire, had become a sepulchre of silence, its grand corridors empty save for the flitting shadows of terrified servants who moved like ghosts, afraid that even the sound of their footsteps might provoke the dying beast in the royal chamber. Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf lay upon his bed, a ruin of skin and bone, his body ravaged by the mysterious pestilence that had begun the very moment the sword severed the neck of Sa'id ibn Jubair. The mighty governor, who had once commanded armies that shook the earth, was now reduced to a trembling child, his eyes wide and fixed on a horror that only he could see. The cold that had plagued him for weeks had settled into a deep, freezing rigor, a chill so profound that it felt as if the marrow in his bones had turned to ice, a foretaste of the Zamharir, the freezing punishment of the abyss. He gasped for breath, each inhalation a jagged struggle against the weight of his own chest, which felt as though it were being crushed by an invisible, mountainous hand. The physicians had long since fled or retreated to the corners of the room, their medicines useless, their potions untouched, for they knew that they were not witnessing a sickness of the body, but a dismantling of the soul. In these final, lucid moments, the arrogance that had defined Hajjaj's life flared up one last time, a flickering candle against the encroaching dark. He did not weep for his victims, he did not call out the names of the 120,000 men he had butchered. Instead, he looked towards the ceiling, his voice a dry, cracking rasp, and uttered a prayer that confounded those who heard it, a testament to the twisted complexity of his heart. "O Allah," he whispered, his lips dry as parchment, "the people claim that you will not forgive me, that I am beyond your reach. But I hope in your mercy more than I fear my sins." It was a staggering defiance, a final gamble by a man who had spent his life believing he was the sword of God, only to find himself cut by the blade of divine justice. But the heavens were silent. There was no thunder, no sign, only the relentless, rhythmic gnawing of the worms in his belly and the chilling echo of Sa'id's final curse, "Let me be the last life he takes." And indeed, since that day in the great hall, the sword of Hajjaj had remained sheathed. He had ordered executions, he had screamed for blood, but his commands had fallen on deaf ears, his authority evaporated like mist before the sun. He was powerless, bound by the chains of a dead man's prayer. As the shadow of death finally crossed his face, the transition was terrifying to behold. His body convulsed violently, arching off the mattress as if he were being dragged away by invisible hooks. His eyes rolled back, revealing the whites, and a guttural, choking sound erupted from his throat, the sound of a soul being ripped from the flesh with the violence of a root being torn from dry earth. It was not the peaceful passing of the righteous, whose souls slip out like water from a pitcher, it was the agonizing extraction of the wicked, a tearing of the spiritual fabric that left the witnesses trembling in horror. And then, he was gone. The scourge of Iraq, the tyrant of the East, the man who made the earth tremble, was nothing more than a cooling husk of meat, indistinguishable from the thousands of paupers he had buried in unmarked graves. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the realization that the monster was dead, yet the fear of him was so ingrained that for a long time, no one dared to approach the bed. They waited, half expecting him to rise again, to scream one last command, to order one last execution. But the stillness remained unbroken. Al-Adl had spoken. The balance had been restored. The burial of Hajjaj was as strange and secretive as his life was public and brutal. His loyalists, few as they were, feared that the people of Iraq, the fathers of the murdered, the sons of the imprisoned, would tear his corpse to pieces if they knew where he lay. They feared the desecration of his grave, the ultimate insult to a man who had built monuments to his own glory. And so, under the cover of a moonless night, they took the body of the once mighty governor out into the wasteland. They did not build him a mausoleum, they did not raise a stone to mark his passing. Instead, they dug a deep, anonymous pit in the dry bed of a river. They lowered him into the earth without fanfare, without the weeping of crowds, and then, in a final act of concealment, they released the waters of the river back into its course. The water rushed over the grave, sealing it beneath a torrent of mud and silt, hiding the tyrant forever from the eyes of men. He who had sought to make his name eternal was now erased from the geography of the earth, walked over by beasts and men who would never know that beneath their feet lay the bones of the man who had once held their lives in his palm. It was a poetic erasure, a literal drowning of his legacy, leaving him alone in the dark, wet earth to face the questioning of the grave. But the story of Hajjaj and Sa'id did not end in the mud of the riverbed. It continued in the realm of dreams, in the spiritual echo that resonates when great injustices are righted. It is recorded in the chronicles of the pious that shortly after his death, a scholar of great renown saw Hajjaj in a dream. In this vision, the tyrant was not clad in silk or surrounded by guards, he was naked, stripped of all pretenses, standing in a vast, grey void of judgment. The dreamer asked him, "O Hajjaj, what has Allah done with thee?" The spectre of the tyrant looked up, his face etched with an eternity of regret and pain. "For every man I killed," Hajjaj replied, his voice a hollow wind, "Allah has killed me once. I have died 1,000 deaths for the 1,000 souls I took." He paused, his eyes filled with a terror that transcended human understanding. "But for Sa'id ibn Jubair, for Sa'id, he has killed me 70 times. 70 deaths for one life." The math of divine justice was not linear, it was exponential. Sa'id was not just a man, he was a symbol of truth, a vessel of the Quran, and to strike him down was to strike at the very foundations of faith. The scales of Al-Adl are precise, weighing not just the act, but the intent, the knowledge, and the reverberations of the crime. Hajjaj had thought he was merely removing a rebel, in reality, he had declared war on the concept of justice itself, and justice had won. When the news of Hajjaj's death finally reached the great scholar Hassan al-Basri, who had spent years hiding from the tyrant's wrath, he fell to his knees, not in celebration, but in prostration of gratitude. "O Allah," he wept, "you have destroyed the pharaoh of this nation." The relief that washed over the Muslim world was palpable, a collective exhalation of breath that had been held for 20 years. The prisons were opened, the innocent were released, and the dark cloud that had hung over Iraq began to dissipate. Yet, the lesson remained, burned into the collective memory of the Ummah. The story of the tyrant and the scholar became a cautionary tale whispered in the courts of kings and the circles of students for centuries to come. It served as a terrifying reminder that power is ephemeral, that the sword is brittle, and that the silence of the oppressed is not weakness, it is a gathering storm. Today, nothing remains of the Green Palace in Wazit but dust and scattered stones, eroded by the winds of time. The city that Hajjaj built to be his eternal capital is a ruin, a ghost town haunted by the memories of its bloody past. But the name of Sa'id ibn Jubair shines brightly in the books of history, revered as a hero of the spirit, a man who conquered a king without lifting a hand. The contrast is the final verdict of Al-Adl, the tyrant who sought immortality through fear is forgotten or reviled, buried beneath the mud of a river, while the scholar who sought nothing but the pleasure of his Lord is remembered with love and honor, his words still echoing in the hearts of the faithful. The tragedy of Hajjaj ibn Yusuf is not that he died, for all men die, it is that he lived in the delusion of his own power, blind to the reality that there is a judge who cannot be bribed, a king who cannot be deposed, and a justice that, though it may be delayed, can never, ever be denied. The worm that gnawed at his entrails was but a small soldier of the divine, a humble creature sent to topple a giant, proving once and for all that in the court of the Almighty, the weight of a single drop of innocent blood is heavier than the throne of the mightiest empire. And so, the story closes not on the might of the Umayyads, but on the silent, enduring victory of the one who bowed his head on the leather mat and entrusted his soul to the one who never sleeps.